We got a hyperdrive. How does it work? Who knows? She'll make 0.5 past light speed. Okay.
Yep. Yep. Well, we're going to go beyond light speed. That's it. We're just breaking science.
If I die tomorrow, I hope you hear these words. I ain't here to flip no birds or sip no syrup. Hope the future generations can get this urge. Stay woke, youngin', and avenge these nerds.
Welcome back to another episode of Nerds of the Rounds, guys. It's your host, Sebastian.
And your boy, Tone from across the hall.
And we got another awesome creative series for you guys on the Nerds of the Round. You may have saw him on one of our recent lives with the comic book school crew, talking about the anthology that he got to take part in, was the prose editor. I got to know this guy through the Creative Aftercon Network, which again, he is an awesome dude, awesome writer, and just, all around awesome guy. I want to give it up for Rubin. What's up?
What's up, guys?
What's up?
Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Yeah, no, we're definitely happy to dive into everything, you've been working on and, and what you're up to and, really excited.
So we're going to ask you the golden question. What got you into writing in comics, Ari? Please give us the origin story.
So I write, as you guys know, I write in a variety of genres, comics, literary fiction, science fiction, fantasy, rhyming poetry, everything in between. And actually the first book that got me into writing was actually The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. I read it in 7th grade. I bought it from the Scholastic Book Flyers. If you guys remember those, Scholastic Book Fair Flyers.
Oh, those are the best.
Yes.
Those were the best.
Yeah, so they had The Hobbit in there. It was some anniversary edition. I read it, loved it, was like, you know what? Those little games I'm playing with my castle Legos and that kind of thing, maybe that could be something. So flash forward years later, I'm starting, to try to write. And actually I met Neil Gaiman. This was around the time that he was on tour for Sandman Endless Nights, if you remember that, when they did one story for each of the Endless, and he was on tour for that. And I had also recently read the novel of Stardust. So not the graphic novel that he did with Charles Vess, but the prose novel that he did of Stardust. So I went to see him, and he did a reading from Endless Nights, and he had a line. Neil Gaiman always has 500 people in the line, and takes you get I had bracelet 250 something or something like that, and he's got all the thing. So I get up to the front and I tell him, I'm like, this book, Stardust, this is like exactly the kind of book I want to write. And he looks at me, you're supposed to stay for something. He says, well, I wrote it because I wanted to read it and nobody else was writing books like that. And that kind of, gave me confidence as a young writer back when I was in my 20s that maybe I could do this.
To showcase your writing, you have a story in the book called Under New Suns.
Yep. Which
is just pretty dope. And it's you write about a story about being named Triangle Alpha 3, aka Tate.
Yes.
And also it seems like it's revolved around him becoming an individual. So how did you come up with this story? What was the thought process? What was it that you want to overall achieve with this?
So this was a very interesting project. It's being put out by Skullgate Media. It's in pre-orders. You could pre-order the ebook now, and the print book is coming out at the end of February, I believe on the 28th. And the process was different than anything else I've ever done because it was a shared world anthology. And unlike most times where you write a story and you submit it to an editor, like if I want to write, I could write a story, I send it off, submit it to a bunch of magazines, hopefully one of them accepts it, or you can find a way if it's long enough, if you have a collection enough to self-publish them yourself. This was completely different. So you sent them a story you've done in the past. Mm-hmm. They decided based on that story whether to take you onto the team or not. And so I got accepted onto the team based on the writing sample that I gave him. And then it was kind of like a long role-playing game that you played for the next month to create the world. So if any of you guys are into Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that, it's kind of like Dungeons. I know you guys do the podcast Dungeons and Dragons.
Right? A whole lot of Dungeons and Dragons.
So this was like that in space. So
okay, cool.
They had a game. I was all online, obviously. Partly because of the pandemic, but partly because it's an international group of writers. And every turn you had to, they gave you a frame story, which is done which is basically what's done in the book. There's a the first chapter is a comic actually that they had the frame story that there's this intergalactic war, there's a United Planetary Alliance, which is, if you think like the Federation in Star Trek, and they're facing some, the bad guys are the Swarm, and they steal this sentient bioorganic ship that turns out to be alive, but they don't really know how it works, and it jumps to the other end of the galaxy, and they have to try to make their way home. And the course of the game, when your turn came up, you got a random prompt, a situation, and you were like, it's like, either the first time around everybody was creating a crew member, so you had to create a crew. Didn't necessarily, for me, it ended up being the one I ended up writing about, but it didn't necessarily have to be the one you ended up writing about. You could write about other characters that other people created, and I have the other characters in the story. So you created a crew person, and then you had a situation. You had to, depending on what you rolled, you had to start a project, you had to advance a project, you had to, put something on the map, like there's, put a new planet on the map, discover something inside the ship, say something about the ship's art. There was a whole list of prompts, and you didn't know what your prompt was going to be until you got it. So we had the framework, and that's how you filled in the map and the crew and all that kind of thing. The second time around, instead of creating a character, you had to complicate somebody else's character. So if, say, Tone, you created a character, or Sebastian, next time around, I would take your character and I would add something to their bio rather than creating a new one. And then
really
by
cool.
the end, you had this shared world. Then there was the period of, now it's time to write your story that takes place within this world. Once it was done, you had 5,000 words, which you could use all on one story like I did, or divide it up into other little stories if you wanted to. And everybody got to write their story. They didn't necessarily have to be completely in sync with each other, but there's this world building framework that you're supposed to fit into.
That sounds that definitely sounds like the D&D rules, and it's like it's actually kind of fantastic way of putting together an exercise and putting together a story. But you also, there's more in this book, because your daughter actually is a featured artist in the book with her artwork right there. Show it off.
Yes. So
how did that feel?
Hashtag proud papa moment.
Yeah. So you see that says the history of the United Planetary Alliance right there. And what happened was, one person wrote their piece, or one of their pieces, in the voice of a young child. It's always a thing when you make a world like this, how are you going to do the info dumping and the world building in a way. So what they did is they decided to write it as an appendix to the book, the history of how we got from Earth to the situation where this war happened. And rather than doing just like a timeline or whatever, this person decided to write it as a school like report. You would have to do a school report, and they wanted illustrations by an actual child. They're like, it'd be really cool if somebody could draw something out of crayon. I'm like, well, my daughter really likes to draw. I'll ask her if she wants to do it. And now it's her first commissioned artwork, and it's in the book.
So talking about that whole that writing process and bringing in your story, the trials that Triangle Alpha 3 goes through, and him becoming his own being, is that something someone else wrote for him?
Or no, that's actually what I wrote. Okay. I told you, this ended up being my character. I ended up liking him and deciding to
just kind of running with it. Okay.
Yeah, just running with the character that I created on my turn, which I don't know if it was the intent when we created it, but it just sort of turned out that way. And so I pictured, like, if you've been thrown across, you're part of a collective hive mind. So think of something like the Borg or something like that.
Yeah, that's what
I got.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, there's other hive minds in science fiction, but that's one everybody knows. So you're kind of a collective hive mind. If you think of that episode, there's that episode of Star Trek where with Hugh, where they try to rehabilitate one of the Borg and he has to come back. turn into an individual. And I thought that's a really interesting idea. That episode ended up being more of a Picard story than a Hugh story. The Hugh was kind of like a subplot because it was really about Picard dealing with his PTSD from when he was Locutus and Borg in those famous episodes. And yes, Hugh becoming human and making friends with Geordi. That was a nice little storyline, but the main storyline, I think, was the Picard storyline. I was thinking, that would be kind of a cool thing to explore, because you have to have a method of communication if you're a hive species, right? There's a transmission of it and of the thoughts of the collective mind. And if you were thrown that far across the galaxy, you might lose the connection with your species. So that was where the idea started. And I had originally where I originally planned it was as he got closer, he would hear them coming in and out, which does happen a little bit in the story, but it ends up, I don't write with an outline. I'm more of a pantster or a gardener. If like there's two kinds of writers, there's plotters and pantsters. So the story goes where it wants to go. Like it tells me where it wants to go once it starts. So it didn't ended up going that way, but it is about how you would create yourself as an individual if you were suddenly cut off from the hive mind while still having to do your duties on the ship. One of the things that I didn't write about the character, but I had to contend with when I was writing the story, was that the original captain of the ship dies, and they elect Triangle to be the captain about a third of the way through the journey. And now he's dealing with this. He's dealing with not having a hive mind. He's also the captain of the ship. There's all sorts of weird 6-dimensional space going on. Space sharks, as I mentioned before.
I will say the space sharks threw me. I'm reading.
Yeah, I was like,
when the hell did the space sharks come in? But it probably, I'm sure it comes up in the earlier stories too. So yeah.
But yeah, so they, the ship is pregnant.
That's also you got a lot going on in this chapter. It was
and you see it's about 2/3 of the way through the book, so there's a lot of,
I was like, you know what, science fiction, I'm just gonna keep it moving.
I mean, they say it's not even science fiction, it's space opera. The thing is, it's space opera, which is more like Star Wars, where it's okay, we got a hyperdrive. How does it work? Who knows? She'll make 0.5 past light speed. Okay.
Yep. Well, we're going to go beyond light speed. That's it. We're just breaking science.
That's like, so they said space opera to begin with, so you don't have to get overly into the physics of it.
You also part of the phenomenal anthology that came out with Comic Book School, which you were prose editor with as well. One of the stories I want to touch up on from that is Mr. Stupendous, which probably was one of my favorites in there and it was funny too. Before I looked at the anthology, before we got to talk to you guys about it, I was having that conversation with people like, we want to see superheroes in a normal situation and setting all that. And you answered that with Mr. Stupendous. Or are we looking at future books? Are we looking at future stories? Are we going to see more of Mr. Stupendous world? Tell us more about Mr. Stupendous and what we can expect from this guy.
Yes. So yes, the short answer is yes. Ariel, who's the artist, is working on a couple of shorts from Mr. Stupendous. So I see it like we're going to have a few. That story is 8 pages from the 8-page challenge, and which was a great anthology. Buddy Scalera and Aaron Donnelly issued the 8-page challenge from Comic Book School, and we have this great anthology that's free to download from the Comic Book School site. And yes, my story in there, my comic story, is Mr. Stupendous, which tells the everyday life of a superhero where he's the most powerful man in the world, but his problems are all too human. So he's up all night fighting crime, so he falls asleep at his desk at work the next day, but he needs that job because, he's a superhero. I mean, if you're the bad guy, you could just, after you, beat someone up, you take their wallet, whatever, right? But you're the
not everyone's Bruce Wayne, you can't just finance your hobby with your business.
You can't do that. So, so how you gonna get by? Your wife's getting kind of suspicious. You're out all night, like every night, and it's like you're not telling her why. So, this could cause problems in your marriage. Luckily, you have superpowers. You might be able to fly to France to get a really nice bottle of wine.
There you go.
There you go. Just
changing a phone booth. It's no phone booths anymore.
No, there were
No cell
not.
phones.
That's what it's like. You
What are you
change your
going to
suit.
change? These types of things, right? These are problems that might come up in the everyday life of a superhero. So it's kind of spoofy, it's kind of episodic, and so that's like the seed story that kind of introduces you to him.
You mentioned that you are a playwright. You did a play. You wrote a play called At the Festival, which is a tragic comedy influenced by Samuel Beckett and Monty Python. I want to, get a detail of the play, but also to what some of the differences in writing a play versus writing a comic, and are they similar?
Yes. Okay. So At the Festival it's another spoof similar to Mr. Stupendous. Not about superheroes, but this one, I have a lot of friends who are more serious playwrights than I am. So I've seen a lot of theater festivals where you go and you see a bunch of plays. And much like any other genre, there's certain tropes that happen at every one of these festivals that you go to where you see the same play over and over and over again. And it kind of makes fun of that a little bit in, I guess, kind of a loving way. And it starts out, there's two actors who've been part of the play festival, but oh no, they forgot their lines. And now they have to make it up as they go along. And of course, they're both seasoned pros, so they can get through their 15 minutes or whatever they've been given by the festival. And, from there, it kind of gets out of hand. So one similarity between a comic and a play is that they are both dialogue heavy. So as opposed to the prose stuff that we are talking about earlier, there's no room for description in really either one of them. Like the description is carried by the actors. There isn't scenery in at the festival because it's black box theater. But for the most part, you have to find out about the character indirectly through dialogue and through action. And in that way, it's very similar to a comic book.
I found out that you do Jeet Kune Do.
Yes, that
and
is true.
I believe you're equivalent to a black belt in Jeet Kune Do?
Yes, equivalent to a third degree black belt. It's third rank, which is just an instructor. Yeah.
And there's lots of questions about that, but I wanted to know, how does martial arts play into your writing process? I know there's a lot of discipline in regards to martial arts. Do you get anything from it? Does it play a role? If you could just speak to that.